In the haze of a September dawn in 1895, salt air from the Atlantic drifted through the open windows of the breakers, perched high above Ochre Point Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island. The estate, commissioned by Cornelius Vanderbilt II and designed by architect Richard Morris Hunt, had just been completed at a recorded cost of $7 million, its marble floors gleaming with the promise of immortality. In the grand ballroom, sunlight scattered across gilded ceilings and the mosaic cartouches, inscribed for the family's glory, while a society columnist from the New York Times declared the opening ball a display to rival European courts. Yet, for all its splendor, a note of tension lingered. The central arch, cut a foot higher than any rival's, spoke not only to ambition, but to a private family feud. The ballroom's grandeur was both shield and weapon, created to humble his brother's nearby marble house. In that stillness, one could already sense the faint echo of absence, the first crack in the illusion of permanence. The origins of the breakers trace back to the height of America's Gilded Age, when fortunes accumulated with such velocity that architectural ambition became the primary language of power. By 1883, Cornelius Vanderbilt II had risen to the presidency of the New York Central Railroad, inheriting a transportation empire his grandfather, the Commodore, had built from ferries and consolidation. His fortune, tallied at $70 million in probate records following his death, provided means for a statement of dominance in Newport's summer colony, where America's wealthiest families gathered each season to perform their status through architecture and spectacle. Across Bellevue Avenue, his younger brother William Kissam Vanderbilt had commissioned Marble House, a gleaming testament to Beaux-Arts splendor designed by Richard Morris Hunt and completed in 1892 at a cost of $11 million. The house stood as both architectural achievement and calculated provocation, its white marble facade and gold ballroom designed by William's ambitious wife, Alva, who sought to establish herself as Newport's social arbiter. Contemporary accounts describe the opening ball as a coronation without a crown, where 500 guests moved through rooms that replicated Versailles in miniature. Cornelius, the elder brother and head of the family's business interests, could not allow such a challenge to stand unanswered. In the complex social mathematics of the Gilded Age, architecture was currency, and silence was surrender. The Vanderbilt family, despite its immense wealth, still carried the stigma of new money. The Commodore had been a rough-spoken ferryman who built his empire through ruthless competition and strategic consolidation. Each generation sought to refine that legacy, to transmute commerce into culture through the alchemy of art and architecture. In the autumn of 1885, Cornelius acquired the modest wood frame cottage known as the Breakers, which had been built in 1878 for tobacco heir Pierre Lorillard the Fier and later purchased by Cornelius for $450,000. The property commanded 13 acres at Ochre Point, where limestone cliffs dropped 70 feet to the Atlantic. The location offered both strategic advantage, visible from the cliff walk where Newport society promenaded each afternoon, and symbolic resonance, the house standing at the edge of the continent as if asserting dominion over the very ocean. For 7 years, the family summered in the original structure, a comfortable but unremarkable dwelling that barely registered in Newport's competitive social landscape. Then, on the night of November 25, 1892, fire consumed the wooden cottage. Accounts differ on the cause. Some blamed faulty wiring in the newly installed electric system, others whispered of kitchen negligence, but the result was unambiguous. By dawn, only the foundation remained, blackened stone marking the perimeter of what had been. Cornelius stood at the ruins that morning, according to a family letter preserved in the Vanderbilt archives, and saw not loss, but opportunity. "We shall build again," he wrote to his wife Alice, "and this time we shall build for the ages." The fire had cleared the ground for something unprecedented, a declaration in stone that would settle all questions of primacy within the family and establish his position as the rightful heir to the Vanderbilt legacy. The architectural commission went to Richard Morris Hunt, who had already designed Marble House for William and was then at work on George Vanderbilt's Biltmore estate in North Carolina. Hunt, born in Vermont in 1827, had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and returned to America as the apostle of European architectural tradition. He understood that for families like the Vanderbilts, architecture was not merely shelter but argument, each room a thesis, each detail a proof of legitimacy. Hunt's office journals from 1893, now housed in the American Institute of Architects' archives, record the scale of Cornelius's ambition. The new breakers would be a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo, spanning more than an acre of built structure. Every material would be imported, every craftsman European-trained, every dimension calculated to exceed Marble House, not through ostentation, but through architectural authority. Where William's house proclaimed its grandeur through gilding and ornament, Cornelius's would achieve supremacy through scale and classical proportion, a more masculine, more enduring form of power. The design process proceeded through the winter and spring of 1893. Hunt's preliminary sketches show a symmetrical facade facing the ocean, with a central loggia modeled after the 16th-century Genoese palaces Hunt had studied during his European travels. The entrance, facing west toward Ochre Point Avenue, would be marked by paired columns and a porte cochere, large enough for multiple carriages. Inside, the great hall would rise 35 feet, its ceiling coffered in oak and decorated with carved details referencing maritime commerce, a subtle acknowledgement of the Commodore's ferry origins, transformed into artistic motif. But the heart of the design, the architectural thesis that would justify the entire enterprise, was the ballroom. Hunt's plans called for a space 104 feet long and 50 feet high, with a ceiling height deliberately calculated to exceed Marble House's gold ballroom by 3 feet. The room would occupy the southern wing, oriented to capture afternoon light from tall windows overlooking the ocean. Its walls would be covered in rose alabaster, its ceiling painted with allegorical figures representing music and the arts, its floor laid in rare marbles arranged in geometric patterns that drew the eye toward the raised musicians' gallery at the far end. A preserved construction ledger documents the materials: 70,000 cubic feet of Italian marble transported from Carrara and Rome, limestone from Caen in Normandy for the exterior walls, oak from Austria for the library paneling, alabaster from Algeria for the ballroom walls. Each material carried not only aesthetic weight, but symbolic freight. The stones themselves were arguments imported from Europe to demonstrate that American wealth could command the world's finest resources. Construction began in the spring of 1893 as the nation slid into economic panic. The collapse of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad in February triggered a cascade of bank failures and business closures that left millions unemployed. Yet at Ochre Point, 200 workmen assembled to raise a monument to permanence while the economy crumbled around them. The contrast was not lost on contemporary observers. While breadlines form in Manhattan, wrote a columnist for Harper's Weekly, marble rises in Newport. The workforce was organized along European guild lines, with separate teams of Italian stonecutters, French gilders, Austrian woodcarvers, and American laborers. Payroll records show that skilled artisans earned between $3 and $5 per day, substantial wages that drew craftsmen from across the Atlantic. The work proceeded in phases: first the foundation, sunk deep into bedrock, then the steel frame, fabricated in Pittsburgh and assembled on site, finally the stone envelope, each block carved to fit precise drawings prepared in Hunt's New York office. By autumn, the skeleton stood complete, its steel bones waiting to be clothed in limestone skin. The framework represented a technological achievement as significant as any aesthetic one. Hidden within the classical facade were structural innovations that allowed the ballroom ceiling to span its full length without visible support. Contemporary engineering journals documented the steel trusses, each piece calculated to bear specific loads while remaining invisible to viewers below. The building was both monument and machine, its appearance of timeless solidity achieved through industrial precision. Hunt's correspondence from this period reveals his understanding of the stakes. "We are raising more than a house," he wrote to a colleague in November 1893. "We are engraving a name in stone, establishing a lineage through limestone. Every detail must speak of permanence, of authority earned not through accident of birth, but through deliberate cultivation of taste. The letter continued with technical discussions of proportion and ornament, but underneath ran a current of anxiety about mortality. Hunt's own health was failing, and he knew the breakers might be his final major work. Through the winter of 1893 and into 1894, the exterior walls rose. Each morning, stonemasons arrived at dawn to continue their work, their breath visible in the cold air as they mortared blocks into place. The limestone, quarried in France and shipped across the Atlantic, arrived rough-cut and was finished on site to ensure perfect joints. Photographs from the construction site, preserved in the Newport Historical Society, show the building emerging from its scaffolding like a sculpture revealed by incremental uncovering. Inside, different teams worked simultaneously on different aspects of the interior. In what would become the Great Hall, plasterers applied ornamental moldings cast from original Renaissance examples. In the ballroom, gilders prepared surfaces for the application of gold leaf, a process requiring absolute precision. The leaf, beaten to near transparency, would adhere only to properly prepared substrates. In the dining room, ceiling painters worked from sketches by Pierre-Victor Galland, a French artist commissioned to create allegorical scenes appropriate to each space. The family maintained apartments in New York during construction, traveling to Newport periodically to review progress. Alice Vanderbilt's letters to her daughter Gertrude described these visits with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "The house grows daily," she wrote in May 1894, "but I confess the scale sometimes overwhelms. We measure our lives in rooms now, 40 completed, 30 yet to finish. One forgets that people, not palaces, must ultimately inhabit such spaces." Her observation pointed to a fundamental tension in Gilded Age architecture. The houses were built as stages for social performance, their rooms designed to accommodate hundreds of guests during the season. Yet for most of the year they stood largely empty, maintained by armies of servants who dusted furniture no one sat upon and polished floors no one walked across. The buildings existed as potential rather than actuality, monuments to possibility more than use. By early 1895, the exterior was complete and work had shifted entirely to interior finishing. This was the most delicate phase, requiring coordination among dozens of specialized craftsmen. The ballrooms rose. Alabaster walls arrived in numbered slabs, each piece cut to fit a specific location in the overall pattern. Venetian artisans laid mosaic floors in the entrance hall and music room, setting millions of tiny tesserae, according to designs prepared months earlier in their Italian workshops. German glassmakers installed stained glass windows in the library, each panel depicting books and scrolls in jewel tones that transformed afternoon light into color. In March 1895, Cornelius wrote to Hunt expressing satisfaction with the progress. "The ballroom begins to reveal itself, and it exceeds even my ambitions. Let it stand as proof that our family has earned its place through achievement, not merely inheritance. Every arch, every column demonstrates that wealth, properly applied, can create beauty that outlasts any single generation." The letter reveals the psychology driving the entire project. Cornelius was not building merely to outshine his brother, though that goal remained, but to answer deeper questions about legitimacy and legacy. The Vanderbilt fortune, built through railroads and competition, carried associations of industrial ruthlessness. Architecture offered a form of moral laundering, transmuting capital into culture, business success into aesthetic achievement. If the ballroom was sufficiently beautiful, sufficiently permanent, it might justify the fortune that created it. Hunt would not live to see his vision completed. In late July 1895, suffering from gout and general decline, he died at his summer cottage in Newport. Cornelius's letter of condolence to Hunt's widow described the architect as a man who understood that stone could speak for generations too distant to address directly. He leaves a monument that none may rival, a building that will outlast the memory of those who commissioned it. The letter was both tribute and epitaph, acknowledging that the breakers was now Hunt's final testament, his argument against mortality made in marble and limestone. The work continued through the summer, under the direction of Hunt's sons and partners. By late August, the house was ready for occupation, though finishing work would continue for several months more. The family moved in on September 2, 1895, carrying with them trunks of clothing, artwork collected over decades, and the accumulated possessions of a family that had never needed to choose between objects. Wealth allowed accumulation without constraint. The opening ball, held on September 14, 1895, established the Breakers as Newport's architectural climax. 500 invitations were sent, each engraved and embossed in gold, each representing a careful calculation about social position and alliance. The guest list, preserved in the Newport Historical Society's archives, reads as a roll call of America's industrial and financial elite: Astors, Gaulets, Belmonts, Fishes, families whose fortunes derived from real estate, railroads, banking, and trade. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe the evening in terms usually reserved for royal occasions. The Great Hall blazed with electric light, wrote the Society correspondent for the New York Times, while in the ballroom, roses hung in garlands from the musicians' gallery. Mrs. Vanderbilt received guests beneath a portrait of herself, wearing diamonds that caught and multiplied the light from crystal chandeliers overhead. The display rivaled anything Europe's courts might offer, proof that American wealth, properly refined, could match old-world aristocracy stone for stone. The ball continued past midnight, with dancing in the ballroom and supper served at tables scattered through the house. The menu, printed on silk, featured 12 courses with wine selected from Cornelius's cellar, a collection valued at over $100,000 and including vintages from the 1840s. Servants moved through the rooms in livery designed specifically for the occasion, their presence both essential and carefully orchestrated to be unobtrusive. In the ballroom, beneath the painted ceiling and surrounded by rose alabaster walls, society performed its rituals of hierarchy and alliance. Young women danced with appropriate partners under the watchful eyes of mothers who understood that marriages at this level were dynastic negotiations disguised as romance. Young men circulated, balancing inherited position against the need to demonstrate capability. Older couples moved through familiar patterns, their positions secure enough to allow relaxation into genuine conversation. And somewhere in the crowd, invisible to most but certainly noted by Cornelius, members of William's family moved through the rooms, their presence both acknowledgement and surrender. Marble House, built 3 years earlier, was now eclipsed, not through ostentation, but through architectural authority. The Breakers made no argument that could be answered. It simply stood, confident in its proportions and its permanence, a house built not for a season, but for the ages. Yet, even on that first night, as light blazed from every window and music drifted across the lawn to the ocean beyond, time was already beginning its work. The house was complete, which meant it had begun its inevitable journey toward incompletion. Every dance marked the floor, every touch left traces on gilded surfaces, every breath added moisture to the air that would, eventually, encourage decay. The ballroom was both triumph and beginning, the moment of greatest glory and the start of slow surrender to entropy. In photographs from the opening ball, preserved in family albums and society publications, the ballroom appears as a space of perfect order, every detail aligned with architectural intention. But if one looks closely at the image, adjusting for the limitations of period photography, one can see already the first signs of occupation. Flowers beginning to wilt in their arrangements, candle wax collecting on sconces, the slight disarray inevitable when hundreds of bodies move through space designed for contemplation rather than use. The house had become real. It was no longer the ideal preserved in Hunt's drawings, no longer the abstraction discussed in letters and construction meetings. It was now subject to time, inhabited by people whose presence would mark it, change it, slowly transform it from monument into memory. The ballroom ceiling, painted to represent eternity through allegorical figures, looked down on a scene of temporal celebration, beauty made manifest but also made vulnerable through manifestation. As dawn approached and the last guests departed, servants began the work of restoration, removing every trace of the evening's festivities. The ballroom returned to its state of ordered readiness, waiting for the next performance. But the house had learned something that night about its true nature. It was not, despite its materials and ambition, permanent. It was a stage, and stages exist only in relation to the performances they host. Without people, without use, the ballroom was merely potential, a space waiting to become meaningful through occupation. Cornelius stood in the empty ballroom that morning, according to a family letter, and felt not triumph, but something more complex. "We have built well," he wrote to Alice, who had retired hours earlier. "But I wonder if anyone will remember in 50 years what drove us to such effort. The house will stand, but will anyone recall why it had to stand precisely here, precisely this way?" The question contained its own answer, though Cornelius could not yet perceive it. The house would stand, but memory would fade. The architectural argument would persist long after everyone had forgotten what question prompted it. The ballroom would become not symbol, but artifact, its meaning transformed by the passage of time from rivalry to ruin to resurrection as museum. But on that September morning in 1895, with salt air drifting through open windows and early light illuminating marble floors, the illusion of permanence still held. The breakers stood complete, confident, ready to fulfill its purpose as stage for the performance of power and cultivation of legacy. It was built to defy time, but time, in the end, is never defied. The autumn of 1895 marked the breakers' full emergence into Newport's social consciousness. The house existed now not merely as architecture, but as cultural fact, a reference point against which other estates would be measured and found wanting. Within weeks of the opening ball, society columnists had established the breakers as the season's defining achievement, the standard by which all subsequent building would be judged. The sheer scale of the operation impressed even those accustomed to wealth's extravagances. Estate account books, preserved in the Preservation Society of Newport County's archives, document the costs of maintaining the property during its peak years. 40 full-time staff worked year-round, their salaries totaling over $60,000 annually. During the summer season, temporary workers swelled the roster to nearly 70. Housemaids, footmen, groundskeepers, kitchen staff, laundresses, and specialists whose sole responsibility was the care of specific materials like the ballroom's alabaster walls or the library's leather-bound volumes. The annual operating cost exceeded $150,000, a sum that purchased not merely maintenance but constant vigilance against entropy. Each morning, maids dusted furniture and polished brass fixtures. Twice weekly, specialized firms cleaned the exterior stonework. Monthly, conservators inspected paintings and tapestries for signs of deterioration. The house demanded continuous labor to maintain the illusion of effortless permanence, to keep decay at bay through systematic, invisible work. Mrs. Alice Vanderbilt managed this domestic empire with the organizational skill of a corporate executive. Her household ledgers, written in careful script, recorded every purchase and expense down to the cost of lamp oil and laundry soap. She met weekly with her chief butler and head housekeeper to review operations, resolve conflicts among staff, and plan for upcoming social obligations. The work was exhausting and endless, a battle against disorder fought room by room, day by day. The family's social calendar structured the year into distinct phases. Winter was spent in their New York townhouse at West 57th Street, a palazzo designed by George B. Post and completed in 1883. Spring brought travel to Europe, Paris for culture, London for society, the Riviera for relaxation. Summer meant Newport, where the breakers became the center of their social universe. Autumn often included hunting trips to their estate in the Adirondacks before returning to Manhattan for the winter season. This pattern, replicated with variations by dozens of wealthy families, created a parallel existence to ordinary American life, while most citizens remained fixed in single locations, defined by work and community. The Vanderbilts and their peers moved through a circuit of properties and destinations, their year structured by leisure rather than labor. The houses they built existed as way stations in this circuit, each designed to accommodate a specific season's requirements. Newport's particular role was social theater. The summer colony operated as a concentrated microcosm of America's upper class, where families competed for precedence through carefully orchestrated performances of wealth and cultivation. Architecture was the stage, fashion the costume, dinner parties and balls the scenes in an ongoing drama of status negotiation. The Breakers gave the Vanderbilts advantages in this competition. Its ballroom could accommodate 500 guests, or 300, depending on whether tables were set for supper. The music room, with its grand piano and superior acoustics, hosted concerts by touring European musicians. The library, lined with rare books and old master paintings, demonstrated intellectual seriousness. The dining room, capable of seating 34 at its primary table, allowed for elaborate dinner parties where seating arrangements represented careful calculations about alliance and precedent. Period letters between Alice Vanderbilt and other society matrons reveal the complex negotiations behind seemingly simple social invitations. "I have placed young Cornelius beside Miss Astor," one note reads, "but must we include the Wilsons? Their position seems increasingly uncertain. Each dinner party was a chess game played with human pieces, every placement carrying implications about social recognition and future possibilities." Edith Wharton, novelist and keen observer of Gilded Age society, attended several events at the Breakers during the 1895 and 1896 seasons. Though she never set novels explicitly in Newport, her fiction captures the psychological pressures of this world, the constant surveillance, the need to perform wealth without appearing to do so, the anxiety that any misstep might result in social exile. Her novel, The House of Mirth, published in 1905, depicts the cruelty lurking beneath society's polished surface, the way fortunes and reputations could be destroyed by a wrong word or inappropriate gesture. The Breakers' design facilitated these performances while obscuring the labor that made them possible. The service quarters, occupying the northern wing of the basement level, included separate spaces for different tasks: laundry rooms with industrial washing equipment, kitchens with the latest cooking technology, pantries for storing china and silver, wine cellars with temperature-controlled storage. An intricate system of bells allowed family members to summon servants from any room, while back staircases ensured staff could move through the house without being seen by guests. This spatial segregation reflected broader social divisions. The Vanderbilts and their guests inhabited the house's public spaces: ballroom, drawing rooms, dining room, library, while servants occupied liminal zones, visible only when performing their duties, otherwise hidden in service corridors and basement workrooms. The architecture created a performance space where wealth appeared effortless, disconnected from the labor required to maintain it. Yet the staff's experience of the Breakers was as real as their employers. Letters from a junior footman, preserved through his descendants' donations to the Newport Historical Society, described the house from below. "We rise before dawn to prepare the house for the family's day," he wrote to his mother in Ireland in 1897. "The work never ends. No sooner is one room cleaned than it requires attention again. The house lives and breathes through our efforts, but we ourselves are meant to be invisible, ghosts maintaining the illusion of permanence." His account reveals the psychological strain of service in such establishments. Servants were required to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to read social cues instantly, to maintain absolute discretion about family matters. They lived in the house, but were not of it, their presence both essential and carefully obscured. The very architecture that proclaimed the Vanderbilts' permanence depended upon their erasure. The summer of 1896 marked the Breakers' peak as social theater. The season opened in June with a garden party for 400 guests, continued through July and August with a succession of dinners, concerts, and balls, and concluded in September with a final spectacular event that society pages described as the season's triumph. The house existed in a state of perpetual readiness, its rooms arranged and rearranged to accommodate different forms of entertainment. Photographs from this period, collected in society journals and family albums, show the house in its moment of fullest expression. In one image, the ballroom is set for a concert, with rows of gilt chairs facing the musicians' gallery. In another, the great hall is arranged for tea, with small tables scattered informally and flowers arranged in massive urns. A third shows the loggia during an afternoon reception, with women in white summer dresses and men in morning coats posed against the backdrop of ocean and sky. These images, though carefully staged, capture something essential about the breaker's purpose. It was architecture as performance, space designed to be looked at, through, and within. The house existed most fully when occupied by guests whose presence activated its purpose. Empty, it remained potential. Filled, it became meaning, a demonstration of power through beauty, authority through aesthetic refinement. But alongside the social calendar ran an undercurrent of family tension. Cornelius and William, despite their surface civility, maintained a rivalry that architecture had expressed but not resolved. They attended each other's events, observed the required courtesies, but their correspondence reveals persistent friction over business matters and family inheritance. The houses they built were proxies in conflicts they could not or would not address directly. Alice Vanderbilt's letters from this period hint at exhaustion beneath the performed confidence. "Sometimes I wonder," she wrote to a cousin in August 1896, "whether we are prisoners or residents. The house demands so much of our time, our energy, our very selves. We built it to establish permanence, but I feel increasingly temporary within these permanent walls." Her observation contained an irony she could not yet fully appreciate. The house would indeed prove more permanent than its inhabitants, outlasting the family's occupation, the social world that created it, even the economic system that made such displays possible. The breakers would remain while the Vanderbilts moved on, transformed from home into artifact, from residence into museum. By the close of the 1896 season, the breakers had achieved its immediate purpose. It stood as Newport's architectural apex, the unchallenged symbol of Vanderbilt primacy. Society acknowledged Cornelius as the family's true head, the elder brother whose judgment and authority were confirmed by the house he had built. William's marble house, though beautiful, existed now in the breakers' shadow, a satellite rather than a sun. Yet this very success contained the seeds of dissolution. Having established dominance, what remained? The house could be maintained, its rooms redecorated, its grounds improved, but the architectural argument had been made. The ballroom stood complete. The ceiling rose to its calculated height. Every material detail had been resolved. The building existed now in a state of completion that was also a form of conclusion, its purpose fulfilled, and thus, in some essential way, finished. As winter approached and the family prepared to close the house for the season, returning to New York for the social calendar there, the staff performed their annual ritual of preservation. Furniture was covered in dust cloths, valuable objects packed away, windows shuttered against winter storms. The house entered a state of suspended animation, waiting for spring to bring it back to life. In those empty rooms during the cold months when snow sometimes fell on Newport streets and Atlantic storms battered the coast, the breakers revealed its other nature. It was not merely stage but structure, not only symbol, but stone and steel. The architecture that seemed so permanent in summer's light appeared more vulnerable in winter's darkness. Wind found gaps in windows, moisture seeped through masonry, cold contracted materials that heat had expanded. The house was subject to physics, to weather, to time's relentless work. A preservation report from much later in 1958 would document damage that likely began during these early winters. Cracks in plaster from thermal cycling, water stains on ceilings from ice dam formation, deterioration of exterior mortar from freeze-thaw cycles. The house aged from its first day, each season adding its particular insults to materials that, despite their quality, could not truly defeat time. But in the warmth of social season, surrounded by light and music and carefully orchestrated performance, such thoughts remained distant. The house seemed eternal, its marble floors and alabaster walls suggesting permanence beyond any single lifetime. The ballroom's painted ceiling depicted timeless allegorical figures, music, art, poetry, whose presence implied that beauty itself might transcend mortality. It was a beautiful lie, one that the Vanderbilts and their guests chose to believe. They performed permanence in rooms designed to suggest it, surrounded themselves with objects that spoke of endurance, built architecture that promised to outlast memory. The house was both stage 4 and symbol of this collective delusion, this shared agreement to ignore time's inevitable victory. In the center of the ballroom, marked in the floor's marble pattern, stood the spot where Cornelius often positioned himself during balls and receptions. From there, he could survey the entire room, watching guests move through space he had conceived and commissioned. The vantage point offered both satisfaction and something more complex, the awareness that all this beauty, all this expense, all this effort would eventually serve purposes he could not predict or control. The house would persist. But the world that created it was already changing, though few at the height of the Gilded Age could recognize the transformation beginning around them. Labor movements gathered strength, political reformers gained influence, the concentrations of wealth that made the breakers possible faced growing challenges from populist movements and progressive taxation proposals. The architecture that seemed so permanent was actually the peak moment before a long decline, the apex before descent. But on summer evenings in 1896, when the breakers blazed with light and music drifted across the lawn, such thoughts remained unthinkable. The house stood complete, confident, seemingly eternal. The ballroom's marble floors reflected candlelight and chandelier glow. The guests moved through patterns of dance older than memory. And for a moment, for a season, the illusion held. Time had been defeated, permanence had been achieved. The architecture would stand forever, a monument to vision and will and wealth properly applied. In that space, in that light, belief seemed possible. The house was real. The beauty was tangible. The permanence was stone. By the spring of 1897, the breakers had settled into its role as the Vanderbilt family's summer residence and Newport's acknowledged architectural summit. The initial excitement of completion had evolved into the quieter satisfaction of established dominance. The house no longer needed to prove its supremacy. It simply embodied it, a fact of Newport's social geography as fixed as the coastline itself. Yet the very completeness that confirmed success also revealed the limits of architectural ambition. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had commissioned the breakers to establish precedence over his brother, to cement his position as family patriarch, to demonstrate that wealth could be refined into lasting beauty. The house accomplished all these goals. But accomplishment is a form of closure, and closure invites the question, what next? The answer, it seemed, was simply continuation, season after season of the same rituals, the same rooms filled with similar guests, the same performances of wealth and cultivation, repeated with minor variations. The house existed in a state of perpetual readiness for events that grew increasingly predictable. Innovation gave way to maintenance, ambition to preservation. This phase of the breakers' existence from 1897 through 1898 resembles a sustained note in music, a moment held beyond its natural duration, beautiful but also static. The house fulfilled its functions flawlessly, but flawless function is not the same as purpose. It had become, in some essential way, a machine for living well, operating with precision but without the animating vision that drove its creation. Contemporary accounts suggest that even the family recognized this shift. Alice Vanderbilt's correspondence from the period contains fewer descriptions of social triumphs, more references to the work of maintenance. "We have 23 guest rooms," she wrote to a friend in July 1897, "and I confess that I cannot recall which family occupied which room 3 weeks ago. The faces blur together, the dinners blend into one another. We perform our roles well, but I sometimes wonder if we are hosts or simply occupants of a very expensive theater." The metaphor was apt. The breakers was, fundamentally, a theater. Architecture designed for performance rather than privacy, for spectacle rather than intimacy. Every room was a stage, every social event a production. The family lived their private lives in the interstices between performances, in moments when the house returned to being merely a house rather than a symbol. Those private moments revealed different aspects of the building. In early morning, before staff had completed their preparations, the ballroom appeared different, dust visible in slanting sunlight, the grandeur softened by the absence of witnesses. Late at night, after guests had departed and servants had completed their cleanup, the library became a refuge where Cornelius sometimes sat alone, reading by lamplight, the house settling into silence around him. These quiet hours suggested an alternative breakers, one defined not by social performance, but by ordinary domestic existence. But such moments were rare, interruptions in the house's primary function. The architecture had been designed for display, and display requires an audience. Without guests to witness, the ballroom was simply a very large, very expensive room, its purpose unmet, its meaning suspended. The tension between public performance and private reality ran through all Gilded Age estates. They were built to be seen, to impress, to demonstrate status through architectural magnificence. Yet families also had to live in them, to find moments of genuine rest and privacy within spaces designed primarily for others' observation. The architecture that proclaimed permanence and confidence could also feel oppressive, demanding constant performance even from those it was meant to shelter. For Alice Vanderbilt, this tension manifested in health complaints that medical records suggest were partly psychosomatic. She suffered from headaches, exhaustion, mysterious pains that doctors could not explain. Modern analysis might recognize these as symptoms of stress, the physical cost of maintaining social performance, season after season. But in the 1890s, such complaints were attributed to feminine delicacy, treated with rest cures and tonics rather than examination of the social pressures that produced them. Cornelius faced different but related strains. As president of New York Central Railroad, he bore responsibilities that extended far beyond Newport's social theater. Business correspondence from this period shows his attention divided between railroad operations, financial markets, and family obligations. He traveled constantly between New York, Newport, and various railroad offices, his life fragmented across multiple locations and competing demands. The railroad industry itself was entering a period of consolidation and conflict. Labor movements gained strength, strikes disrupted operations, and political reformers challenged the rate structures that generated Vanderbilt profits. Cornelius, inheriting his grandfather's empire, also inherited the animosity that empire had generated, the sense among many Americans that railroad fortunes represented exploitation rather than entrepreneurship. This context gives different meaning to the breaker's magnificence. The house can be read as defense as much as celebration, a demonstration that railroad wealth had been refined into beauty rather than mere accumulation. If the money came from shipping rates and monopoly power, the argument went, at least it had been transformed into architecture that rivaled European palaces, culture that matched old-world aristocracy. Yet this argument required acceptance of premises that growing numbers of Americans rejected. Why should private fortunes command Europe's finest materials while factory workers lived in tenements? Why should one family's summer cottage cost more than entire towns could raise for schools and hospitals? The questions grew more insistent as the 1890s progressed, voiced by populist politicians, reform journalists, and labor organizers who saw no beauty in marble purchased through exploitation. The breakers existed at the intersection of these conflicts, its limestone walls marking not just property boundaries, but ideological divides. For the Vanderbilts and their social circle, the house represented legitimate achievement, wealth properly employed to create lasting beauty. For critics, it symbolized inequality's excesses, a monument to self-regard built on others' labor. Neither view was complete. The house was both beautiful and excessive, both achievement and indulgence. Its materials were exquisite, its proportions masterly, its details refined beyond measure. But it was also absurd. 70 rooms for summer occupation, 40 servants to maintain spaces the family barely used, costs that exceeded most Americans' lifetime earnings spent annually on maintenance. This duality haunted the breakers from the beginning. Even those who admired its architecture could not entirely escape awareness of the grotesque disproportion between means expended and needs served. The ballroom was magnificent. It was also ridiculous. Both truths coexisted, creating a cognitive dissonance that visitors then and now struggle to resolve. Richard Morris Hunt, who died before the breakers' completion, understood this tension. His late letters reveal an architect wrestling with the implications of his work. "We create beauty," he wrote to a colleague in 1894. "But beauty in service of what? I have designed palaces for princes of industry, monuments to fortunes that dwarf Renaissance dukes. Yet I wonder sometimes if we have built too well, made permanence too convincing. These houses will outlast the families that commissioned them, will stand as puzzles for future ages to decipher." His concern proved prescient. The breakers would indeed outlast the Vanderbilt family's occupation, would transform from residence into museum, from symbol of wealth into artifact of history. But in 1897, such transformation remained unimaginable. The house stood at its peak, confident and complete, seemingly permanent beyond question. The summer season that year proceeded through its established patterns. Guests arrived, were entertained, departed. Dinners were served, conversations conducted, social hierarchies performed and confirmed. The ballroom hosted dances where Newport's young people moved through choreographed steps, while their elders watched from gilded chairs along the walls. One such event, described in the New York Herald Society pages for August 1897, captures the period's flavor. The breakers' ballroom was transformed into a Venetian fantasy, the account reads, with gondola decorations and Italian musicians playing from the gallery. Mrs. Vanderbilt received guests wearing emeralds said to have belonged to Catherine the Great, while the ballroom's rose alabaster walls glowed in the light of 2,000 candles. The scene spoke less of Newport than of a timeless realm where beauty and wealth had achieved perfect synthesis. The journalist's language reveals the mythology the breakers had generated. It was no longer merely a house, but a portal to timeless realms, a space where ordinary rules seemed suspended. The architecture, the decoration, the social performance combined to create an alternative reality, one where wealth's consequences could be forgotten in favor of aesthetic contemplation. Yet even as guests moved through this carefully constructed fantasy, reality pressed at the edges. Servants maintaining the illusion worked 18-hour days during the season, their exhaustion hidden behind professional masks. Kitchen staff prepared elaborate meals in sweltering conditions, their discomfort unacknowledged by diners who praised the cuisine's delicacy. Groundskeepers maintained the 13-acre property's appearance of effortless perfection through labor that began before dawn and continued past dusk. The architecture, designed to obscure this labor, succeeded perhaps too well. The service corridors, the back stairs, the basement workspaces, all remained invisible to guests who experienced only the polished surfaces, the seamless service, the apparently effortless magnificence. They moved through a world without friction, unaware of the mechanisms that produced the smoothness they enjoyed. This invisibility extended beyond the physical spaces to the people who maintained them. Servants appeared when summoned, disappeared when dismissed, their existence acknowledged only as function rather than humanity. They were ghosts in the machine, essential but erased, present but not seen. A few contemporary observers recognize this dynamic's implications. Thorstein Veblen, economist and social critic, published The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899, analyzing precisely the kind of conspicuous consumption the breakers represented. He argued that such displays served primarily to demonstrate status, that their economic function was waste, deliberate destruction of resources to prove one's distance from productive necessity. Veblen's analysis applied perfectly to the breakers. The house was, in economic terms, pure waste, capital removed from productive circulation and fixed in marble and bronze. Its value lay not in utility, but in display, not in function, but in symbol. The ballroom existed not because anyone needed a space 50 feet high and 104 feet long, but because such dimensions demonstrated wealth beyond practical constraint. Yet Veblen's cold economic logic missed something essential about human motivation. The Vanderbilts did not build the breakers merely to waste resources or display status. They built it because they believed architecture could confer meaning, that beauty properly pursued might justify fortune, that permanent structures might defeat mortality. This belief, however misguided, was genuine. Cornelius wanted not just a bigger house than his brothers, but a better one, architecture that would stand as testimony to his judgment and taste. He wanted permanence, legacy, a form of immortality through stone. The house was his argument against oblivion, his demonstration that he had existed and built something that would persist beyond his lifetime. This motivation is more sympathetic, if no less problematic. The desire for permanence is universal, transcending class and economic position. But the resources available to the Vanderbilts allowed them to pursue that desire on a scale that distorted its essential humanity. The wish to be remembered became a 70-room palazzo. The hope for legacy became 70,000 cubic feet of marble. By late 1898, subtle signs of strain began to appear in Cornelius's correspondence. His letters grew shorter, less detailed, sometimes trailing off mid-thought. Business associates noted his distraction during meetings, his apparent difficulty concentrating on complex financial matters. His handwriting, previously bold and confident, became smaller and more tentative. Alice mentioned these changes in letters to her children. "Your father seems weary," she wrote to their daughter Gertrude in November 1898. "The responsibilities weigh heavily, I think. He speaks sometimes of rest, of leaving affairs to others, but such thoughts are unlike him. I worry that the burdens he has assumed, the railroad, the family interests, this house and all it demands, have accumulated beyond his strength to bear." Her concerns were well-founded. On September 12, 1899, while in New York on business, Cornelius suffered a stroke. He survived, but the man who emerged from the medical crisis was diminished, his left side partially paralyzed, his speech slurred, his memory uncertain. At age 55, at the peak of wealth and social position, his body had begun to fail. The stroke marked an abrupt transition in the breaker's story. The house, built as demonstration of vitality and permanence, now hosted an invalid whose presence reminded all who saw him that bodies fail, that time claims every victory, that architecture outlasts but also overshadows the architects of ambition who commission it. Cornelius would live another year and a half after the stroke, but they were years of slow decline. He spent most of his time at the breakers during the summer of 1900, sitting in the loggia overlooking the ocean, wrapped in blankets even on warm days, his gaze distant and unfocused. Visitors who had known him in his prime found the transformation shocking. The railroad president reduced to silent observation, the family patriarch now dependent on constant care. Alice maintained the household's functions with determined grace, but the social calendar contracted sharply. The balls and dinners that had filled previous seasons gave way to quiet evenings and small family gatherings. The ballroom stood empty most of that summer, its magnificence unwitnessed, its purpose suspended. In those silent months, the breakers revealed yet another aspect of its nature. It was not merely a house, but a witness, architecture that would persist beyond the lives it sheltered. The rooms that had hosted triumph now accommodated diminishment. The spaces designed for performance became settings for a private drama of aging and decline. On September 12, 1899, exactly 1 year after his stroke, Cornelius Vanderbilt II died. The newspapers carried the news with appropriate gravity, noting his business achievements and social position. But even in death, he could not escape the architecture he had commissioned. "Mr. Vanderbilt," the Times obituary noted, "will be remembered for many achievements, but perhaps none more enduring than the breakers, the Newport estate that stands as monument to an age of unprecedented ambition and excess." The house had become his epitaph, the thing by which he would be remembered. Whether that represented success or failure, immortality achieved or personality erased, remained ambiguous. The breakers stood. Cornelius was gone. The marble floors he walked now echoed with other footsteps. The ballroom he commissioned would host other celebrations, other dramas. The architecture had outlasted its architect, as architecture always does. The house built to defeat time would itself become time's instrument, measuring generations by its persistence, marking eras by its transformations. It was no longer Cornelius's house, if it had ever truly been. It was now simply the Breakers, a place that would accumulate meanings he could not have imagined, serve purposes he never intended, outlast not only his lifetime but the entire social world that made its construction possible. In the ballroom, afternoon light still scattered across rose alabaster walls. The painted ceiling still depicted timeless allegorical figures. The marble floor still gleamed with polish. But the house was already something different, no longer a demonstration of current power, but a monument to past ambition, no longer present, but already becoming history. The grandeur remained, the beauty persisted, but the meaning had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. The house built to establish permanence had instead documented transience. The ballroom created to humble a brother now stood as reminder that all triumphs are temporary, all monuments eventually become ruins, all attempts to defeat time serve only to mark time's passage more precisely. In silence, the architecture spoke its truth. Permanence was illusion. Beauty was real. And time, in the end, claims everything, even, perhaps especially, the structures built to deny its power. The Breakers entered the new century orphaned of its primary creator, but firmly established in Newport's social architecture. Alice Vanderbilt, now widow and owner, assumed responsibilities that extended far beyond household management into preservation of reputation, family position, and the architectural legacy her husband had commissioned. She was 51 years old in 1900, mother to 7 children ranging from their teens to early 30s, custodian of a fortune estimated at $70 million, and occupant of one of America's most recognizable houses. Estate account books from the early 1900s document the financial burden of maintaining the Breakers without Cornelius's railroad income. The property cost between $150,000 and $175,000 annually to operate. Expenses that included staff salaries, grounds maintenance, utilities, repairs, insurance, and the endless procurement of supplies necessary to run a 70-room household. Alice's inheritance generated sufficient income to cover these costs, but the margin was narrower than it had been during Cornelius's lifetime, when railroad profits could absorb any household expense without notice. The staff roster remained at 40 permanent employees, supplemented during summer seasons by additional temporary workers. Their wages, though modest by the standards of the wealth they served, represented the estate's largest ongoing expense. A butler earned between $70 and $90 monthly. Housemaids received $20 to $30, footmen $40 to $50. These salaries, while better than typical domestic service wages, still reflected the profound inequality structuring Gilded Age America. A family spending hundreds of thousands annually on one house while paying the people who maintained it wages that barely exceeded subsistence. Service in establishments like the Breakers offered certain advantages beyond salary. Staff received room and board, uniforms, access to medical care through family physicians, and association with prominent names that could enhance future employment prospects. Yet the work remained demanding, the hours long, the required deference absolute. A footman's diary from 1902, preserved through family descendants, describes days beginning at 5:30 in the morning and ending near midnight, with brief afternoon rest periods, the only respite from constant readiness to serve. "We are invisible unless needed," the footman wrote, "and needed without being visible. The skill lies in anticipating requirements before they are expressed, in maintaining perfect service while seeming not to exist. The house demands this constant erasure. We are ghosts keeping the machine running, present only as function rather than person." His account captures the peculiar psychology of elite domestic service. Servants occupied the house but could never fully inhabit it. They knew its spaces more intimately than the family did, knew which floorboards creaked, which faucets leaked, which windows stuck in humid weather, yet remained fundamentally alien to the social world those spaces hosted. They maintained the stage but could never join the performance, their knowledge of the building's physical reality coexisting with exclusion from its social meaning. Alice managed these operations with efficiency, learned through decades of running large households. Her daily routine included morning meetings with senior staff to review the day's requirements, afternoon consultations about menu planning and table settings, evening supervision of dinner service and guest entertainment. She maintained this schedule, whether hosting 50 guests or dining alone with family, understanding that the house's successful operation depended on systematic attention to detail. Her position as widow and household head also involved navigating Newport's complex social hierarchies. The summer colony operated according to unwritten rules that determined who could call on who could invite whom to dinner, who deserved precedence at balls and receptions. These rules, though apparently arbitrary to outsiders, reflected careful calculations about family lineage, fortune origin, social contributions, and personal reputation. Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, whose estate stood nearby on Bellevue Avenue, served as one of Newport's social arbiters alongside Alva Vanderbilt, Cornelius's sister-in-law, and Mrs. Astor. Their approval or disapproval could elevate or destroy social position, making them gatekeepers whose opinions carried weight disproportionate to any formal authority. Alice, as resident of Newport's grandest house and inheritor of Cornelius's position, held status that commanded respect, but also invited scrutiny. Any misstep, an inappropriate invitation, an incorrect precedence, a social obligation unfulfilled, could damage reputation and, by extension, diminish the family's standing. The Breakers itself functioned as tool in these negotiations. Its architecture demonstrated the Vanderbilt family's permanent place in Newport society, its material solidity arguing for social permanence as well. Alice used the house strategically, hosting events that reinforced alliances, excluded rivals, and maintained the family's position at Newport's social apex. The ballroom that Cornelius had built to humble his brother became Alice's instrument for sustaining the dominance that architecture had established. Summer seasons from 1901 through 1905 followed predictable patterns. The family arrived in June, traveling from New York by private rail car with trunks of clothing, artwork to be displayed for the season, and the accumulated possessions deemed necessary for summer residence. Staff had spent weeks preparing the house, removing dust covers, cleaning windows, polishing furniture, arranging flowers, ensuring that every room met exacting standards of readiness. July and August brought the social season's peak. Dinners for 30 or 40 guests occurred several times weekly, each requiring days of preparation, menu planning, wine selection, table setting, seating arrangements calculated to honor precedence while encouraging conversation. Larger receptions and balls demanded even more extensive preparation, transforming the Breakers into a kind of temporary production facility dedicated to creating spectacular social events. Contemporary accounts describe these events with language that reveals both admiration and underlying awareness of their artificiality. Mrs. Vanderbilt's garden party transformed the Breakers' grounds into a scene from pastoral fantasy, wrote a society columnist for Town and Country in August 1902, with striped pavilions, string quartet, and refreshments served on tables scattered beneath ancient trees. Yet even as one admired the scene's beauty, awareness persisted that this pastoral vision required armies of workers to create and maintain, gardeners, caterers, musicians, all laboring to produce the illusion of effortless beauty. The columnist's observation identified the central paradox of Gilded Age social life. The performances required enormous effort while appearing effortless, demanded comprehensive preparation while seeming spontaneous, depended on workers who remained invisible while their absence would have rendered the entire enterprise impossible. The artifice was both obvious and denied, acknowledged implicitly while ignored explicitly. The Breakers' architecture facilitated this paradox through spatial segregation. Guests experienced continuous beauty, progressing from entrance hall to drawing rooms to ballroom without glimpsing the service corridors, kitchens, pantries, and back stairs where the machinery of entertainment operated. The house presented a carefully edited reality, showing only what would confirm wealth's cultivation while concealing the labor that produced the display. This edited reality extended to the house's material culture. The objects filling the breakers, furniture, paintings, tapestries, decorative arts, were not merely possessions, but arguments. Each piece demonstrated the family's refined taste, their access to global markets, their ability to command Europe's finest production. A Gobelin tapestry hanging in the drawing room spoke of connections to French manufactories. A Renaissance bronze on a library table announced familiarity with old master art. Persian carpets, Chinese porcelain, Italian marble, each material carried symbolic weight beyond its aesthetic value. Thorstein Veblen's analysis of conspicuous consumption illuminated these dynamics. The objects existed not primarily for use, but for display, their function more symbolic than practical. The tapestry's value lay not in its ability to cover walls, but in its demonstration of wealth sufficient to acquire rare textiles. The Renaissance bronze mattered less as sculpture than as proof of cultivated taste and historical knowledge. Yet to dismiss these objects as merely symbolic would miss their genuine aesthetic achievement. The Gobelin tapestries were exquisite examples of weaving art. The Renaissance bronzes demonstrated sculptural mastery. The paintings, while selected partly for their social meaning, were also beautiful objects worthy of contemplation. The house contained real art and real beauty, even if those qualities served purposes beyond aesthetic appreciation. This duality characterized the Breakers itself. It was both genuine architectural achievement and excessive display, both beautiful palazzo and monument to inequality. Contemporary viewers struggled to resolve this contradiction, to reconcile admiration for the craftsmanship with unease about the social system that made such concentrated beauty possible. Some visitors avoided the contradiction through selective attention, focusing on beauty while ignoring context. Others embraced the house as uncomplicated celebration of American achievement, proof that New World wealth could match Old World cultivation. Still others saw the Breakers as evidence of a social order requiring reform, a monument to excess that demonstrated the need for progressive taxation and wealth redistribution. All three responses had validity. The house was beautiful. It did represent achievement, and it also embodied troubling inequality. These truths coexisted without resolution, reflecting the broader contradictions of Gilded Age America, a society simultaneously creating unprecedented wealth and generating profound inequality, celebrating individual achievement while ignoring systemic exploitation, building magnificent architecture while millions lived in tenements. The Breakers existed at the intersection of these contradictions, its limestone walls marking boundaries both physical and ideological. For those inside, the Vanderbilts, their guests, the servants maintaining the illusion, the house was simply reality, the environment within which their lives unfolded. For those outside, tourists walking the cliff walk, laborers maintaining Newport's infrastructure, reformers critiquing wealth's concentration, the house symbolized everything wrong with American capitalism, a palace built on others' exploitation. Neither view captured the full complexity. The house was both more and less than its symbolic meaning suggested. It was stone and marble, wood and bronze, actual materials assembled according to architectural principles. It was also performance space, social instrument, argument about power and permanence. It was beautiful and excessive, achievement and indulgence, monument and problem. By the middle years of the decade, subtle changes began to appear in Newport's social landscape. The generation that had built the great houses, the Vanderbilts, Belmonts, Astors, was aging or passing, their children inheriting not just fortunes, but social positions they had not earned through their own efforts. This transition introduced uncertainty into hierarchies that had seemed fixed. Younger Vanderbilts approached Newport differently than their parents had. They had grown up with wealth, never experienced the struggle to accumulate or the anxiety about social acceptance that had driven their parents' generation. For them, the Breakers was simply the summer house, a given rather than an achievement. They took for granted what their parents had labored to establish, accepting privilege without fully comprehending the effort required to create and maintain it. This generational shift appeared in small ways at first. The younger generation traveled more extensively in Europe, sometimes preferring continental society to Newport's more rigid hierarchies. They explored new forms of entertainment, automobiles, yachts, aviation, that their parents viewed with suspicion. They questioned social conventions that seemed increasingly arbitrary, especially as progressive-era reforms challenged the very foundations of Gilded Age society. Alice, managing the breakers through this transition, found herself caught between eras. She maintained the standards and rituals she had learned, understanding that social position required constant performance. But she also recognized that the world was changing, that the certainties of her youth no longer commanded universal acceptance. Her letters from the period reveal a woman increasingly aware of historical forces beyond her control, sensing that the social order she inhabited was more fragile than it appeared. "We maintain the forms," she wrote to a friend in 1907, "because forms are all that remain when belief fades. The dinners, the balls, the careful attention to precedents. These rituals give shape to time, provide structure to lives that might otherwise feel purposeless. But I confess to wondering sometimes whether we are the last generation to take such things seriously, whether our children will look back on these performances with embarrassment or simply incomprehension." Her observation proved prescient. The social world that had created the breakers was already entering its final phase, though few recognized the transformation occurring around them. The house stood at its peak of physical magnificence, its marble floors polished, its gardens perfected, its rooms filled with treasures. But the social meaning that had animated its creation was beginning to dissipate, like morning mist burning off in summer sun. The architecture remained. The beauty persisted, but the conviction that such things mattered, that social precedents justified such expenditure, that houses could establish permanence, that marble walls could defeat time, that conviction was weakening, challenged by forces the Vanderbilts could neither control nor fully understand. Yet, through the middle years of the decade, the breakers continued to function as it had been designed to function. Guests arrived, were entertained, departed, dinners were served, conversations conducted, social hierarchies performed and confirmed. The house existed in a kind of extended present, maintaining forms that seemed eternal even as the context supporting them eroded. In the ballroom on summer evenings, chandeliers cast light across rose alabaster walls. Musicians played from the gallery, their music drifting through rooms designed for such performances. Guests moved through choreographed patterns of dance and conversation, their presence activating the architecture's purpose. And for those moments, the illusion held. Time was suspended. Beauty was real. The house fulfilled its function as stage for the performance of wealth's cultivation into culture. But in morning light, when guests had departed and servants had completed their cleanup, the ballroom revealed its other nature. It was simply a very large room, 50 feet high and 104 feet long, its dimensions justified by symbol rather than function. The space existed primarily to be seen, to demonstrate capability, to argue through architecture what could not be spoken directly. It was, in the end, Cornelius's answer to his brother's challenge, Alice's tool for maintaining social position, the family's monument to itself. But it was also becoming something more, an artifact of an era, a document of a particular moment in American history when wealth concentrated to unprecedented degree and expressed itself through architecture of corresponding ambition. The house was transitioning from present to past, from residence to relic. But that transformation remained invisible to those living through it, to the family occupying rooms designed for their comfort, to guests admiring walls commissioned for their impression. The change occurred too slowly to perceive, like continental drift or erosion, undeniable in retrospect but imperceptible in the moment. The breakers stood complete. The summer seasons continued, and time, patient and implacable, continued its quiet work of transformation, turning monuments into memories, certainties into questions, permanence into time's latest temporary victory over those who would resist its advance. The summer of 1908 brought changes both subtle and significant to the breakers and to Newport society more broadly. The architectural landscape that had defined the previous decade remained largely intact. The great houses still lined Bellevue Avenue, their facades confident and their grounds immaculate. Yet, beneath this physical permanence, Shifts in economy, culture, and politics were beginning to erode the foundations that had made such displays possible. The financial panic of 1907 had shaken American markets, forcing bank consolidations and exposing vulnerabilities in the system that had generated Gilded Age fortunes. While the Vanderbilt holdings weathered the crisis better than many, the episode reminded even the wealthiest families that markets could fail, that fortunes could evaporate, that the apparent solidity of capital was always, to some degree, an illusion maintained through collective confidence. Newport itself reflected these tensions. The summer colony continued its rituals, but observers noted a defensive quality creeping into the performances. The balls seemed more determined, the displays more insistent, as if the participants sensed that their world required justification in ways it had not previously. Progressive reformers, gaining political influence, openly criticized the concentrations of wealth that made estates like the Breakers possible. Journalists toured Newport to document excess, their articles dripping with sarcasm about families spending more on single parties than workers earned in lifetimes. These critiques stung precisely because they contained truth. The mathematics of inequality had become impossible to ignore. The Vanderbilts' annual expenditure on the Breakers exceeded 500 times what their servants earned, a ratio that seemed to violate basic notions of fairness even among those who benefited from the arrangement. The house, which had been commissioned as demonstration of achievement, was increasingly cited as evidence of systemic injustice. Alice Vanderbilt, managing the Breakers through this period, found herself defending choices she had not made but inherited. She had not commissioned the house, had not determined its scale or cost, had not created the social system that made such architecture possible. Yet, as its current occupant, she bore responsibility for its continued operation, and by extension, for what it represented. Her response, documented in letters and actions, was essentially conservative, to maintain what had been established, to fulfill obligations as she understood them, to preserve not just property, but the social forms that gave property meaning. She continued the summer seasons, hosted the expected events, maintained staff and grounds according to established standards. To abandon these responsibilities would have been, in her view, a betrayal of Cornelius's vision and an abdication of her position. Yet, even as she maintained forms, she could not escape awareness of their increasing hollowness. The same events repeated year after year with diminishing returns, the same guests, the same conversations, the same performances of hierarchy that seemed to matter less with each iteration. The social world that had created the Breakers was not collapsing so much as fading, its certainties dissolving into questions that no one quite knew how to answer. This sense of twilight appears in contemporary accounts of Newport during these years. Edith Wharton, having moved away from New York society, published The House of Mirth in 1905 and The Custom of the Country in 1913, novels that dissected Gilded Age society with surgical precision, exposing the cruelty and emptiness beneath its polished surfaces. Her fiction captured what letters and journals could only hint at, the awareness among participants that their world was both significant and absurd, that the forms they maintained mattered intensely within their circle but meant nothing beyond it. The Breakers, in this context, became a kind of monument to contradiction. It was still Newport's grandest house, still commanded respect and admiration, still functioned as intended. Yet it also increasingly resembled a museum, its rooms perfect but lifeless, its beauty real but disconnected from the social energies that had animated its creation. The house existed in a state of suspension, maintained immaculately but inhabited tentatively, preserved carefully but lived in superficially. The family's relationship to the Breakers reflected this ambiguity. They occupied it each summer, used its rooms, entertained in its spaces. But they also spent increasing time elsewhere, in Europe, in New York, at other properties. The house was theirs but did not fully contain them, served their purposes without defining their lives. It had become a stage they periodically inhabited, rather than a home they truly occupied. This partial occupation affected the house's character. Rooms that had once hosted regular use stood empty more often, their furniture covered, their shutters closed. The ballroom, built for spectacle, might host 2 or 3 major events per season rather than the weekly entertainments of earlier years. The scale that had once demonstrated ambition now seemed excessive, the grandeur disproportionate to actual use. Estate records from 1909 document the first significant reductions in operating costs. Staff roster dropped from 40 to 35 permanent employees, with temporary summer workers reduced accordingly. Maintenance schedules were adjusted, with some tasks performed quarterly rather than monthly. These changes, while relatively minor, marked a shift from expansion to contraction, from confidence to caution. The reductions affected service quality in ways visible only to those who understood the house's operation. Brass fixtures were polished less frequently, allowing slight tarnish to accumulate. Certain rooms were closed entirely during the off-season, their maintenance deferred. Gardens required constant attention to maintain their appearance of effortless beauty, and reducing the groundskeeping staff meant accepting slightly less perfection, grass cut less frequently, flower beds replanted less often, hedges trimmed less precisely. These small economies might seem trivial, but in context, they represented something larger, the beginning of acceptance that total perfection could not be sustained indefinitely, that even the wealthiest families faced resource constraints, that maintenance of such estates required continuous expenditure that might eventually exceed capacity or will to continue. Yet the house itself, built to last, showed little sign of physical decline. The materials Hunt had specified, Caen limestone, Carrara marble, Austrian oak, aged well, requiring maintenance but not replacement. The steel structure supporting the ballroom remained sound. The mechanical systems installed during construction continued to function. The building had been engineered for permanence, and permanence within limits had been achieved. This divergence between physical durability and social sustainability defined the breaker's trajectory through the early 20th century. The architecture could persist almost indefinitely with proper maintenance. But the social conditions that had made its construction possible and its operation sustainable were eroding, creating a situation where the building might outlast the wealth and will required to maintain it. Similar patterns affected other Newport estates. Families that had built confidently in the 1890s faced difficult choices in the 1900s, whether to continue maintaining expensive properties used only weeks per year, whether to accept reduced standards, whether to sell or even demolish houses that had become burdens rather than assets. The summer colony, which had expanded so rapidly during the Gilded Age's peak, was beginning to contract, its apparent permanence revealing itself as historically contingent. The breaker's advantages in this changing landscape derived partly from the Vanderbilt fortune scale. Where other families might struggle to maintain Newport estates, the Vanderbilts could absorb costs without immediate hardship. But even substantial wealth could not indefinitely support operations that consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, while generating no economic return. The question was not whether such expenditure could continue, but how long, a timeline that depended on factors beyond the family's control. These uncertainties lent a different quality to social events during this period. Contemporary accounts describe parties that felt more valedictory than celebratory, gatherings infused with awareness that the world they represented was changing. Mrs. Vanderbilt's summer ball achieved its usual magnificence, wrote a Society columnist in August 1910. Yet even as one admired the ballroom's beauty and the company's elegance, one sensed the shadow of impermanence. The same forms were performed, the same hierarchies observed, but the conviction animating these rituals seemed attenuated, as if participants were enacting traditions they no longer quite believed in. This loss of conviction appeared in small behavioral changes. Younger guests sometimes openly questioned social conventions their parents had accepted without challenge. Conversations in drawing rooms increasingly touched on political reforms, labor movements, and progressive taxation proposals, topics previously considered inappropriate for social discussion. The boundary between Newport's insulated world and the broader society surrounding it was becoming more porous, allowing external pressures and alternative perspectives to penetrate spaces that had been carefully protected from such intrusions. The physical boundary between the breakers and its surroundings, The property's walls and gates, the distance from Newport's commercial districts, could not prevent these conceptual intrusions. Ideas moved more easily than people, and ideas about wealth's proper limits, about inequalities in justice, about social obligation and collective responsibility were circulating with increasing force through American public discourse. These ideas found some resonance even within wealthy families. Younger Vanderbilts, educated at universities where progressive thought gained academic legitimacy, sometimes expressed discomfort with inherited privilege. They questioned whether summer cottages requiring 40 servants represented defensible use of resources, whether social hierarchies based on fortune rather than merit deserved maintenance, whether the forms their parents valued so highly might be not just outdated but ethically problematic. Such questions rarely progress to action. The beneficiaries of privilege seldom voluntarily relinquish its benefits. But the very fact that questions arose marked a shift from the unquestioning confidence of earlier decades. The Gilded Age had been characterized by certainty that wealth indicated virtue, that accumulation proved merit, that those who possessed fortunes deserved them. That certainty was dissolving, replaced by defensiveness, justification, and increasing awareness that the social order enabling such concentration of wealth might not persist indefinitely. The breakers, standing at the center of this contested landscape, became a kind of litmus test for broader debates about American capitalism. Preservationists saw it as cultural achievement deserving protection. Critics viewed it as monument to excess requiring reform. The family occupying it existed between these positions, aware of both the house's beauty and the inequality that made it possible, defending their inheritance while sensing that defense might eventually prove insufficient. Through all these debates and doubts, the house itself remained largely unchanged. The limestone walls stood firm against Atlantic weather. The ballroom's painted ceiling suffered no crisis of confidence, its allegorical figures depicting eternal verities regardless of the temporal anxieties afflicting those who passed beneath. The marble floors, properly maintained, retained their polish. The architecture at least achieved the permanence its creators had sought. But architecture without occupation becomes ruin, and occupation without conviction becomes performance without meaning. The breakers existed in an increasingly precarious balance, still functional, still beautiful, but also increasingly anachronistic, a monument to values and social structures that were being challenged, if not yet overthrown. In quiet moments, when the house stood empty between social events, its true character emerged. It was vast, vastly expensive to maintain, vastly disproportionate to practical needs, vastly impressive in scale and detail. That vastness, which had once argued for the Vanderbilt family's legitimate claim to social primacy, now seemed to argue something different, for the absurdity of such concentration, for the impossibility of justifying such expenditure, for the fundamental misalignment between the house's scale and any reasonable definition of sufficiency. These were not comfortable thoughts for those responsible for the house's continued operation. Alice Vanderbilt, entering her 60s, found herself defending choices made by her deceased husband, justifying expenditures she had not determined, maintaining a property whose purpose had become less clear with each passing year. She continued because continuation was what she knew, because abandoning the breakers would have felt like betraying Cornelius's memory, because the house had become too central to family identity to simply walk away from. Yet she must have wondered in private moments whether persistence represented loyalty or stubbornness, whether maintaining the breakers honored the past or simply delayed acknowledging its irrelevance to a changing present. The house demanded so much of attention, resources, energy, and the returns on that investment were becoming increasingly intangible. The social victories it facilitated mattered less than they once had. The beauty it contained could be admired without being owned. The permanence it represented was beginning to seem less like achievement and more like imprisonment. As the decade progressed toward 1910, these tensions remained unresolved. The breakers stood, magnificent and burdensome, beautiful and excessive, achievement and problem. It had outlasted its creator, was outliving the social world that made its creation possible, would eventually outlast the family that inherited it. The house was succeeding at permanence, but success at permanence meant existing long enough to see all the meanings originally attached to it fade, transform, or reverse. The ballroom, empty now more often than occupied, waited for purposes its builders never imagined: museum exhibition, historical artifact, tourist destination. But in 1910, such transformations remained decades away. For now, the breakers continued as residence, stage, monument, and problem. All these things simultaneously, none completely. The architecture had no choice but to persist. Stone cannot decide to crumble, marble cannot elect to dissolve. The house would stand as long as resources existed to maintain it, would function as long as someone inhabited it, would mean whatever meanings observers chose to project onto its silent stones. In that silence lay both threat and promise: threat that meaning would be lost, promise that new meanings might yet emerge. The breakers, built to establish one family's permanent dominance, was becoming something larger and stranger, a monument to time itself, to the way all human purposes eventually dissolve, while the structures expressing them endure, transformed from argument into artifact, from symbol into simply stone.